All right, today is Dada, Surrealism, and the White Cube. One of my favorite quotes about this lecture is, so this is where all the weirdness in the art world comes from. Um, so it can be one of the topics of love it or hate it. And I will say, since this is a video lecture, you're really missing out. Sometimes I come dressed up in all kinds of funky clothes on this day, really just to engage with the Dada Manifesto, which you'll hear a little bit about um, as well. I'll have a reading on a video rather than me reading it to you. So it could be good or bad depending on your outlook here. Without further ado, kind of get into it here. Something that I really like to point out is that Dada was an artistic and literary movement. It actually began as a literary movement, and you'll hear that manifesto in a moment. And it arose to the reaction of World War I, the nationalism, repressed social values, conformity of culture, and thought that many thought had led to the war. And if we have any history buffs out there, or even, you might just know how the death toll in World War I was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. It was like the birth of chemical warfare, trench warfare, and actually, timely enough, it's with coronavirus right now. I just want to bring up the Spanish flu is also really kind of wreaking havoc on people. In wartime was like a perfect way for that disease to spread, and there was a lot of political downplaying of the flu and the way that it was spreading because they didn't want to lose support for the war. So a little interesting side note as I'm giving a lecture here from quarantine and learning how to do videos. So anyway, it influenced other avant-garde movements like Cubism, Futurism, Constructivism, Expressionism. The list really you could just keep on going here. So Surrealism's left out there. I think we see it a lot in terms of collage and the material agency that we now have in contemporary art. We can really think to Dadaism as really kind of throwing everything out the window and saying, we're going to go for it. So I want us to listen to this manifesto.
Every product of disgust capable of becoming a negation of the family is Dada, a protest to the fists of its whole being engaged in destructive action. Dada, knowledge of all the means rejected up until now by the shame-faced sects of comfortable compromise and good manners. Dada, abolition of logic, which is the dance of those impotent to create. Dada, of every social hierarchy and equation set up for the sake of values by our valets. Dada, every object, all objects, sentiments, obscurities, apparitions, and the precise clash of parallel lines are weapons for the fight. Dada, abolition of memory. Dada, abolition of archaeology. Dada, abolition of the prophets. Dada, abolition of the future. Dada, absolute and unquestionable faith in every god that is the immediate product of spontaneity. Dada, elegant and unprejudiced leap from a harmony to the other sphere. Trajectory of a word tossed like a screeching phonograph record to respect all individuals in the folly of the moment. Whether it be serious, fearful, timid, ardent, vigorous, determined, enthusiastic, to divest one's church of every useless, cumbersome accessory, to spit out disagreeable or amorous ideas like a luminous waterfall, or coddle them with the extreme satisfaction that it doesn't matter in the least, with the same intensity in the thicket of one's soul, pure of insects for blood, well-born and gilded with bodies of archangels. Freedom, Dada, 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 a roaring of tense colors and interlacing of opposites and of all contradictions, grotesques, inconsistencies. life.
So what does that mean? What I will say is the manifesto and one of kind of the key phrases that rose out of this movement was an absurd world needed to be combated with equal absurdity. Right, so they're seeing people, the death tolls in the war, just astronomical figures that we can't even really comprehend unless you experience some, and and so this is really a reaction to that. And if we look back to the last lecture about context and content, we really need to be looking at this work within the context of the time period, seeing, war, pandemic, right, and and really admire what's happening within that time period. So Dada was the first conceptual art movement, right? So that's important. And the focus of the artist was not on creating aesthetically pleasing objects, but on making works that upended the bougie, right? If I can use that, the bourgeois sensibilities, and that generated difficult questions about society, the role of the artist, and the purpose of art. All right, so it was not about making objects for the bougie, but really, being highly critical and asking questions about society. It reacted against the constraints of the rational mind, and by extension, the rules of a society that they saw oppressive. All right, so reacting against the constraints of the rational mind is also a real important note. All right. I just want to kind of move through some Dada work here, just so you can kind of see what was happening and how that manifesto was really influencing work. Right, this is the first time I really see collage. Also, squares arranged according to the laws of chance. Not necessarily an aesthetic placement, right? So according to chance, says the title. LHOQ. Marcel Duchamp appropriated the Mona Lisa here. We'll think about appropriation quite a bit more here in the coming weeks. And you're actually going to be asked to do a little appropriation project yourself. So let me start thinking about what appropriation means to you, and what kind of content or imagery you might want to appropriate yourself. Just as a little plug there. This has a fairly offensive title. If you want to look into that, you can. See, they love in the kind of chaos in the composition. For us, art is not an end in itself, but is an opportunity for the true perception and criticism of the times we live in. The Dada poet Hugo Ball. So they're highly experimental, right? Reimagining what art and art making could be, using unorthodox materials and chance-based procedures, emphasize spontaneity, right? And they love collage, photo montage, experimental theater, performance. There's all kind of wacky stuff coming out. And we'll see some really kind of interesting photo montage that kind of start changing some processes. And we can't go through this lecture without taking at least 3 looks at the urinal at Fountain, right? Just as a little reminder, this was the piece that was snuck into an exhibition, and it said that they would accept anything. So he snuck this in, and then people saw it and were super pissed and infuriated. Like, it's so offensive. How could he possibly put this into an art exhibit, right? So they threw it away, and then he had Duchamp had someone on the inside told him, dude, they threw away your urinal. So he's like, all right, I'll get back hard to work to try to create another one in time, right? So he tears another urinal off the wall and signs it sneaks it back into the exhibition. So What's kind of funny is that all of, there's a few of these reproduced, like, in major museums or whatever. They're all reproductions. The original was thrown out. So we'll revisit Duchamp here later in the lecture a little more. Um, get on to some more nice mixed media collages. So Dada's aesthetic was marked by its mockery, materialistic, and nationalistic attitudes. All right, and that's kind of another important note. And the movement dissipated as the pendulum kind of swayed over to surrealism, but the ideas really became a cornerstone of various categories of modern and contemporary art that we even see still today. So if you hate Dadaists, but you like Beth Kavner's work, or like other ceramic sculpture, it's like ceramic is a material that was not a serious art material for a long time. So we might even be able to think Dada in some weird way. If you like Salvador Dali and surrealism, you like the kind of the reaction against the rational mind, well, we can thank Dada for that as well. All right, so Man Ray is someone in the textbooks that he's like right on the line. He was working with the Dadaists, but then they kind of start to call him a surrealist. So he's really someone who bridges the gap between these two movements in a really meaningful way. And we're going to watch just a short video on this. I think it's really fascinating.
In 1915 in New York, a young painter named Man Ray was introduced to the artist Marcel Duchamp. But Man Ray spoke no French, and Duchamp knew little English, so they played a game of tennis. Duchamp scandalized the art world in 1917 when he anonymously submitted an ordinary plumbing fixture to an art exhibition. This was one of several everyday objects Duchamp presented as art and called ready-mades. The two of them shared ideas, and Man Ray began experimenting, making art from whatever materials were lying around his studio. He had initially taken up the camera to photograph his own work, but now he began making evocative pictures of ordinary objects, in a sense, a photographic answer to Duchamp's ready-mades. In 1920, he photographed a kitchen mixer and an assemblage of objects from his darkroom. He called these two pictures Man and Woman. The two artists produced many works in collaboration, and Man Ray helped Duchamp create his alter ego, Eros c'est la vie. But Duchamp returned to France, and Man Ray found himself out of sorts. In 1921, he too set sail for Paris. There he was taken in by a group of poets, artists, and anarchists who admired and embraced his work in ways New York had not. Still, in the midst of this thriving culture of creative thinkers, he struggled to make a living. To support himself, he took up portrait photography. If I'd had the nerve, I'd have become a thief or a gangster. Since I didn't, I became a photographer. The writers, the intellectuals, and artists living in Paris at that time began to seek him out to have their portraits taken. Once, when working in the darkroom, he made an accidental discovery when he dropped an unexposed sheet into the developer. Regretting the waste of paper, I mechanically placed a small glass funnel to graduate in the thermometer on the wetted paper. I turned on the light. Before my eyes, an image began to form, not quite a simple silhouette, but distorted and refracted by the glass. Taking whatever objects came to hand, my hotel room key, a handkerchief, some pencils, a brush, a candle, a piece of twine, I made a few more prints, excitedly enjoying myself immensely. They looked startlingly new and mysterious. He named his new creation the rayograph. He wrote triumphantly to a patron, I have finally freed myself from the sticky medium of paint and am working directly with light itself. For all their simplicity, the rayographs powerfully evoke space and movement. He orchestrated complex compositions, often making multiple exposures for a single picture, and coaxed mysterious shadows out of ordinary objects. Over the next decade, he made hundreds of photos in this manner and conducted other experiments in the darkroom. I deliberately dodged all the rules. I mixed the most insane products together. I committed heinous crimes against chemistry and photography. Man Ray once said he set out to violate every rule in photography. Throughout the 20s and 30s, he continually pushed the frontiers of the photographic medium, achieving works of rare beauty and strangeness. He applied his talents to portraiture, fashion, and advertising. Along the way, he opened new avenues for creative photography and produced some of the most memorable and iconic pictures of his time.
Pretty amazing stuff. That's an aesthetic that once you see it, you know it. And if you're in a museum, you'll be able to tell from across the room if there's a Man Ray or Ray graph. And I would highly encourage you to spend the time with it. It's pretty significant in the art world. And like I said, he's one of those figures that really kind of bridged the gap between Dada and Surrealism. But one of my rhetorical questions I'd love for you all to kind of think about: what's the significance of the manner of experimentation and novel way of approaching art and art making? Right? How is this relating to Dada, and how is it influencing the contemporary art world today, even? I just kind of want to also go through a few art movements that were happening at this time. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but I think it's really important for us to just kind of pay attention to what's happening in the art world, kind of while Dada and Surrealism are really kind of taking the world by storm, and kind of the history textbooks as well. And it's a group of Dutch abstract artists who promoted a style of art based on strict geometry of horizontals and verticals. And you'll see some work here that you definitely recognize in here, right? Mondrian, and really, really pointed color palettes as well. Constructivism, excuse me, replace art's traditional concern with the composition with a focus on construction. So that is kind of another way to say the last point here. There's a truth of materials, the belief that materials should be employed only in accordance to their capacities. All right. Work would be dictated by its materials, not the other way around. And you'll kind of see that right here in the form, right? We see, really, there's no hiding what this material is. We kind of have a more rigid view of this bust. The materials are forefront in the work. Bauhaus. This is a great, really interesting movement. Has major impact on Europe and the United States long after it closed. We had schools here in the United States, Bauhaus schools. And it's an interesting thing because it really values the handmade object, the well-designed object. It believes that beauty can be found anywhere and it should be everywhere, right? So aesthetically pleasing and highly functional, right? And there's a little bit of kind of theorizing that the Bauhaus movement will kind of come back around. So it's sought to reunite creativity and manufacturing to level to level the distinction between fine and applied arts. Right? Really wanted to rejuvenate design for everyday life. Remember that what I just kind of said, functional and beautiful. And emphasize practical skills, crafts, and techniques with the goal of problem solving for a modern industrial society. But if you're gonna remember one thing from the Bauhaus, I'd say that's functional and beautiful. All right, and the fonts too. I don't know if anyone's been forced to watch Helvetica in a high school art class or otherwise, but it really took fonts into consideration. If you notice, all my lectures are the same font. I really like Oswald because I'm an open source guy. So it's like the idea that everything should be considered, right? And look at that teapot, functional and beautiful, right? Surrealism, the moment we've all been waiting for. A 20th century literary, philosophical, and artistic movement that explored the workings of the mind, championing the irrational, the poetic, and the revolutionary. That is the kind of textbook Tate Modern definition. I personally don't love it. It's really hard to find a good surrealist definition, and this movement is so hard to kind of encapsulate, but I think that we'll all kind of have our own understanding of this, and I'm kind of looking to the art assignment here, as she can talk so fast and articulate so well what it would take me an hour to do. So I really ask for your full attention on this video. I think it's really important.
Melting clocks, bowler hats, peculiar household objects, dream sequences, but also uncanny incidents, dorm room posters, more dream sequences, and according to Merriam-Webster, the year 2016. The word surrealism has become a catch-all for the bizarre, the irrational, the hallucinatory. But when it emerged in Europe during the tenuous, turbulent years following World War I and leading up to World War II, surrealism positioned itself not as an escape from life, but as a revolutionary force within it, a movement aimed at the wholesale liberation of the individual, aesthetic as well as political, literary as well as visual, originating in Paris but ultimately international, freed from the constraints of a singular style or medium, yet driven by a charismatic leader. Surrealism was ambitious, contradictory, and complex, and it has a history you might not guess from how the word is used today. This is the case for surrealism. The term surrealism first appeared in the writings of French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who used it in 1917 to describe Jean Cocteau's ballet Parade and his own play The Breasts of Tiresias. For Apollinaire, surrealism meant the fruits of the human imagination freed from the task of imitating nature. Its roots lay in the ethos of Romanticism and eccentric 19th century figures like the symbolist fantasist Gustave Moreau, the self-taught artist and customs agent Henri Rousseau, the disquieting visionary Arnold Böcklin, and writers like Edgar Allan Poe. Surrealism also emerged out of the riotous spirit of DADA, a movement originating in Zurich and Berlin, which sought to upend artistic traditions and disrupt the conventionality of modern life, weaponizing nonsense against the institutions that had brought about the catastrophe that was World War I. Yet the Surrealists were after not just disrupting the world order through nonsense, but reinventing it through experimental tactics. The first of these is automatism, or involuntary unwilled action. In 1924, a young poet named André Breton published the Surrealist Manifesto, defining surrealism as psychic automatism in its pure state, dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. Breton had been experimenting with this pure state since 1919, when he co-authored a book-length stream of consciousness poem called The Magnetic Fields. Breton's automatism is based on the work of Sigmund Freud, who theorized that human subjects are divided between our conscious minds, dominated by reason and restrained by social manners, and the unconscious, our hidden reservoir of instincts, desires, and unprocessed experiences that our conscious mind works hard to repress. To unleash the unconscious, surrealists did things like transcribing dreams and recording trance states under the auspices of their Bureau of Surrealist Research. The surrealists insisted that our repression was not just psychic, but social, and that liberating the unconscious would have collective, politically revolutionary consequences. Transform the world, said Marx. Change life, said Rilke. For us, it's one and the same, Breton wrote. Surrealist magazines were filled with dream accounts, stream of consciousness writings, automatic drawing exercises, even rapid-fire questionnaires, all serving to unleash the unconscious by circumventing the control of the conscious mind. One of the first surrealist films, made by Germaine Dulac and Antonine Artaud, explored the consciousness of a clergyman afflicted with impure thoughts. It was advertised as a dream on the screen and set up a parallel between films and dreams, both being spaces of fantasy and automatized imagination. The Surrealists engaged in chance operations in pursuit of automatism, often outsourcing creative control to their materials. André Masson poured sand over skeins of glue to produce turbulent landscapes or mythological beasts. Man Ray illuminated objects on light-sensitive paper to create unpredictable compositions from their shadows. Others employed frottage or rubbings, brûlage or the burning of photographic negatives, and decalcomania, in each case surrendering control to the process and aspiring to what Breton called the marvelous, or that part of the self that lies beyond the reach of reason. They also outsourced creative control to each other, playing literary and drawing games, such as the famous Exquisite Corpse, where the final poem or image was the product of their collective imagination. Chance, for the Surrealists, also meant long directionless walks recorded in the novels Paris Peasant and Nadja. It included chance encounters with so-called found objects, such as the ones Breton described seeing in flea markets, which he claimed could resolve both psychological disturbances and artistic blocks. The famous line of the poet the Comte de Lautréamont, as beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table, became a kind of catchphrase for the movement, encapsulating its pursuit of the unexpected. Many of these found objects made their way into Surrealist work in the 1930s, arranged in compositions that resembled reliquaries or mysterious erotic contraptions, seeking the marvelous through the unexpected juxtaposition of objects. Merritt Oppenheim, shown here posing for Man Ray, created one of the most enduringly evocative Surrealist objects. It was inspired by a conversation with Picasso and Dora Maar at a cafe, where Picasso admired Oppenheim's fur bracelet and remarked that one could cover anything with fur. She replied, so the story goes, even this cup and saucer. And then she brought this object into being. Found objects could be images too. In the collage books of the German artist Max Ernst, images clipped from pamphlets and ads populate his narratives with chimera or swim up through layers of gouache like steeping scraps of childhood memories. Other works include forms of ethnographic photographs, such as the Concombois corn silo that Ernst transformed into part elephant, part war machine. A photograph of an African village turned on its side and misinterpreted as an image of a Picasso portrait catalyzed Salvador Dali's so-called paranoid critical method, a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the critical and systematic objectivity of the associations and interpretations of delirious phenomena. Or in other words, make a science of your madness? Like other avant-gardes before it, Surrealism drew inspiration from non-Western or so-called primitive cultures, which for them provided an alternative set of aesthetic and social values. Surrealist exhibitions often incorporated objects from other cultures alongside their own inventions. But for the Surrealists, these cultures were not simply a timeless other. They identified their movement as anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist, mounting an anti-colonial exhibition and publishing pamphlets to protest the racist and imperial presumptions of the 1931 colonial exhibition in Paris. The Surrealist interest in the uncanny is a key ingredient in the persistence of and why we just can't forget many of these images. Freud explained it as something that seems both familiar and strange at the same time. For the Surrealists, this meant combining ordinary things in extraordinary ways, but it also meant the appearance of ghosts, masks, robots, and dolls. These were doubles for the living, human-like but not human. It also meant this pipe, which may look like a pipe, but it's also not a pipe. It's a double or a depiction of a pipe. Photography, which can itself be seen as a process of doubling, was especially good at generating the uncanny effect. It could be manipulated with multiple exposures and infinitely reproduced. Claude Cahun's photos often engaged in uncanny doubling, while also playing on the performance and fluidity of identity, often in collaboration with her partner, Marcel Moore. This practice would prove handy during the forthcoming war, when they disguised themselves to sneak into German gatherings and distribute anti-Nazi propaganda. As the threat of National Socialism grew and a Second World War approached, Surrealists in Western Europe dispersed, some going into hiding, others into exile. Breton fled to New York, where a critical mass of exiled members staged in 1942 an exhibition they called First Papers of Surrealism, referring to the bureaucratic applications of the emigrating artists. Marcel Duchamp strung several hundred feet of twine through the installation, ensuring that both the newly arrived artists and those who came to see their work would be confronted by their disparate misplaced status. Back in Europe, Juan Miró began a series of paintings on paper just as the war broke out and he fled Paris. Constellations maps a complex network of nodes that appear simultaneously to coalesce into forms and disperse into vectors, testifying to a network that must sustain itself with only traces of absent bodies. While the core European surrealists disbanded, new and related movements emerged abroad, from Mexico City to the Caribbean to New York, where a new generation of artists would soon take up the charge of liberating psychic energies. Though the movement largely concluded with World War II, many of the tactics of the surrealists bled out into wider culture and began to be used toward commercial ends, leaving behind much of the revolutionary, consciousness-transforming energy that birthed it. Surrealism left in its wake a wide range of techniques that artists still use today, integrating found objects, experimenting with automatism or the disorienting effects of collage, and summoning the uncanny body to socially critical ends. Ultimately, the surrealists believed that if we could find meanings that exist beyond the rational mind, we might be freed from the tyranny of the mundane, of logic, and that we might discover truths more real than reality. What's more, surrealism gives us a way to think about the connection between individual creative freedom and collective liberation, even as it reminds us how fragile that connection can be under the rise of fascism. Breaking down the boundaries between dreams and waking life, between cultures and between each other. Surrealism remains an example of how reimagining ourselves can be the definitive step toward changing our world. In retrospect, it may seem naive, but then again, in retrospect, everyone looks naive. That doesn't mean we stop trying.
All right. She always does a great job. I hope that you pressed pause, re-listen to a couple things, what have you. But we're just going to move through a few more surrealist images without words, right? So you can just kind of enjoy them for what they are without them moving so fast. So just one of the most famous here. And we're going to do a quick video here as well. If you're squeamish, I guess tread lightly. I don't want to spoil the moment, but you should be able to tell when it's coming. So just a little warning there. Woo! This kind of gets me every time. There's a couple beautiful things there, though. The cloud as it moves over the moon, kind of repetition of that shape, which is then the eye being slit, right? It's just a kind of an interesting thing. And then respecting the special effects for 1929, I think is pretty amazing. So moving along with a couple more surrealist images here. Just a little side note, there's a really good Rene Magritte book in the library here at Western. If you have a chance and you're bored or need a break from your studies, I highly recommend checking it out. Exquisite Corpse. So this is a game that I am asking all of you to do with your roommates, your parents, whoever you're living with. It's great fun. And so anyway, they mentioned it in the video briefly as well. It's a game in which each and each participant takes a turn writing or drawing on a sheet of paper. You fold it to conceal what you're doing, and then you pass it to the next player. So this game really gained a lot of popularity in the 1920s. The Surrealists right there kind of surrendering some control. So I just want to show you a few examples here. This one is actually divided into 4 pieces. I usually do 3 personally. You can do 4 if you want. So there's a fold right there on the top, and a fold here, and then a fold there, right? So, you know, if we were doing this in class, I'd probably give each section like 5 minutes, right? But the idea is that there's like a head, an abdomen, and then like a feet or legs and feet zone. So that's kind of why I usually do it into 3 sections. Here's another example here. And what I will say is it is incredibly helpful. I think this one was just 2 sections. Excuse me. So if like, let me just go back here. If you know, you leave like a line right here going into the next section, so they know where to start, so that they're not like, you know, starting to draw over here for some reason. But it is important that no one knows what you're doing. I'll also, if you're doing 3 people, it can be fun for you all to start your own, so that you have something to do while the other person's drawing. So anyway. Maybe if you're doing it during your quarantine hours, you do one, you know, for a day or an hour or whatever, 5 minutes, however long you're going to do, and then, you know, you give it to somebody else, and so they can't actually see you working. But so the last section today is the white cube, and this is actually really important information to your success in the class and just how you approach work in the world. I used to do full day lecture on this because you know, the artist that I am, like, this is really, you can go all in on this, but there's really only a couple things that we need to know. So I am going to move kind of quick. But the main thing I want you all to know is the difference between the white cube and salon style. So go ahead and write that down. Like a hair salon, all right? So this is kind of the white cube. The white cube refers to a strategy of displaying works of art in museums and galleries that had been gaining prominence since the early 20th century. Okay, so the white cube is a white wall gallery, all right? So it's built from private collectors and donors, was often displayed in popular salon styles with works of art arranged at various heights on the wall. So just to kind of say that a different way, salon style right here, right, is the technique where works of art are arranged at various heights on the wall, all right? And then the white cube is usually all eye level. Okay, we'll look at a couple of examples of that in a moment. I really want to make sure we get the salon style, works of art arranged at various heights on the wall. All right, and I'm going to kind of flash through just some major institutions for a moment. This is a great example of salon style. All right, it would be like, you know, historically, it would be, you know, someone in power that has this really kind of beautiful, you know, room that has everyone in their family painted, right? The royalty kind of painted, kind of show wealth and power. And this is also how major institutions were showing their work at one point also, all right? But then the National Gallery in London began to experiment with this white cube style. They made it eye level, so visitors didn't have to crouch or crane their necks to see the work, right? This resulted in a gallery wall that suddenly became emptier, and its own color scheme playing a more important role. So the first time the color of the walls was explicitly up for discussion. And this is a point where I could really kind of just go ham for a while and really bore you all to death. But what is important, all right, is that the white cube style of displaying work is eye level, right? and it's on white walls. And this kind of signifies to us that we're in a different kind of space, all right? Usually it means we're in a nice kind of gallery space where there's going to be some kind of content to the work generally. You know, we want enough space for us to be able to consider each piece individually. If you walk into some of these more tourist style galleries, right, where we're selling a lot of landscape paintings and whatnot, there'll be a salon style, right? It's more, we're trying to get more in there, trying to make a better use of that square footage, right? So it's just kind of, and you also think about it in terms of, you know, historical period rooms where in a room like this, you might sometimes have them, you know, at different levels, all right? And the fact that this is now painted a different color kind of signifies a different time period, right? So white cube also started to be more selective of what works were shown. So just as a side note, and the MoMA in New York was the first institution to use eye level spacing white wall standards, and there's now like a Smithsonian standard that says, you know, what that eye level is, 53 inches on center, just for example. All right, and here's a good example of that. So that in any museum you go in today, it's probably gonna look something like that. All right. There's some. And the White Cube Gallery in London went as far as to name themselves the White Cube. Yeah. All right, so a little artist spotlight to finish up, a little Marcel Duchamp with that, you know. I do want to point out that he was actually a really, really talented artist, painter in his own right, before he started, you know, throwing urinals on pedestals. You know, he was kind of rejected by the Cubists by being not Cubist enough, but you have you know, Picasso and Duchamp right next to each other, and sometimes you can't even tell the difference. It's really kind of a funny thing. So anyway, we got the urinal, all right, and another famous stool and bicycle wheel. It's like, oh my gosh, like, you know, you can let an art historian go on for hours. Is it motion and sedentary, right? What is it, the repeating of the shape, the stool and the wheel? I mean, or is it just as simple as you had a bicycle wheel and a stool in the studio and you put them together? The world will never know, right?
Although he trained as a painter, the French artist Marcel Duchamp is known for the radical break he made from traditional art forms by inventing the ready-made, a term he coined to refer to an existing object that is taken from its original context and regarded as a work of art. In the 1910s, Duchamp began appropriating ready-made objects, including a bicycle wheel, a shovel, and a urinal, which he then signed, retitled, and presented as artworks in their own right. He did this most famously with his ready-made fountain, perhaps one of the most controversial artworks in history. Duchamp's work is characterized by a taste for jokes, tongue-in-cheek wit, and subversive humor, rife with sexual innuendos. His questioning attitude towards definitions of identity and authorship is personified by his alter ego, Rose Salavi. In the mid-1930s, Duchamp began to make miniature reproductions of all the work he had made to that point, for La Boîte en Valise, box in a suitcase.
I thought of the idea of a box in which they would be mounted like in a small museum, portable museum, so to speak, and there it is.
This leather case contains 69 miniature reproductions, including Fountain and the portrait of Rose Salavi. Duchamp made 24 versions of the case, and each of these features a different, hand-coloured original fixed to the inside of the lid. The box unpacks in such a way that some sections slide out, with other folders and black-mounted prints inside. For Duchamp, there was no clear distinction between the original and the reproduction, a concept cleverly embodied in this piece. The case is also reminiscent of a travelling salesman's display case, containing a selection of Duchamp's work like a portable museum, made for his move to New York in the 1940s. Duchamp's influence has increased over time, and artists such as Andy Warhol, Damien Hirst, and Sarah Lucas have been referred to as Duchampian. He is also spoken of as being the godfather of conceptual art, with his focus on the artist's idea over aesthetics and skill. There's no doubting that Duchamp, in the age of the machine, was and still is one of the world's most influential artists.
All right. That about does it for today, but I hope you appreciated some of where all the weirdness in the art world came from. Remember to do your own exquisite corpse exercise and take a photo of it and turn it on Blackboard. Some pretty fun and easy points. All right. So I really look forward to seeing those. All right, guys.